The most powerful mafia boss in South Korea, a man who made entire criminal empires kneel, once abandoned a pregnant woman with nothing but a phone call and a check she never cashed. 10 years later, fate sent him the bill. And the price wasn't money. It was having to look into the eyes of the son he denied. A boy who turned out to be everything he never deserved. If you want to know how a man who chose power over love gets brought to his knees by a 10-year-old boy, stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hot. The rain came down hard over Seoul the night Kang Tae-jun's older brother was buried. Not a funeral with mourners and flowers and polished eulogies. The Black Serpent Syndicate didn't do things that way. There were no priests, no hymns, no candlelight vigils. What there was instead was a private cremation at 3 in the morning in a facility outside the city that didn't appear on any municipal registry, attended by 11 men in dark suits who stood with their hands folded and their faces carved from granite, and one woman, Kang Soo-yeon, 63 years old, head of the syndicate's inner council, and mother of the man now reduced to ash, who watched the flames with dry eyes and a jaw so tight it could have cracked stone. Tae-jun stood 2 feet to her left and said nothing. He had not cried. He wasn't sure he still knew how. What he felt instead was something colder and more complicated than grief, a kind of vertigo, the sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous and feeling the ground beneath him begin to shift. Kang Min-jun, his brother, his blood, the man groomed since birth to lead the syndicate into the next generation, was gone. Taken out by a single bullet behind the left ear in the parking structure of a luxury hotel in Gangnam, which meant someone inside their world had approved it, which meant the war that had been simmering for 18 months had finally broken open. And now there was only Tae-jun. His mother turned to look at him as the furnace doors closed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look said everything. The inventory of him, the calculation behind her eyes, the question she was already running the numbers on. She had spent 30 years building Min-jun into a successor. She had spent those same 30 years treating Tae-jun like a useful secondary asset, an enforcer, a problem solver, someone to send when a message needed to be sent with fists rather than words. Now, he was all she had left. He looked away from her and stared at the floor. The drive back to the main compound took 40 minutes through empty, rain-soaked streets, and Tae-jun sat alone in the back of an armored SUV with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink and a phone full of messages he didn't read. His head leaned against the cold window. Outside, Seoul moved past him in blurs of neon and wet asphalt, the city indifferent to the fact that the structure of one of its most powerful criminal organizations had just been shaken to its foundation. He was 34 years old. He had spent the last decade becoming the kind of man people feared rather than loved, which was a trade he had made deliberately, and then spent 10 years pretending he hadn't regretted. Most days, the pretending worked. Most days he could fill the space where other things used to live with enough work, enough danger, enough forward motion that the quiet never caught up with him. Tonight the quiet had caught up with him. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes, and for one unguarded moment, less than a breath, barely a heartbeat, he allowed himself to think about Baltimore. He shut it down immediately, locked it behind the same internal door he had built specifically for that purpose, reinforced over 10 years until it felt almost solid. Almost. He drank the whiskey after all. The syndicate's emergency council convened at 6 the following morning in the secure boardroom on the 14th floor of a commercial building in Mapogu that officially belonged to a real estate holding company. 11 men and his mother. Maps on the screens. Intelligence reports stacked in manila folders. The name Park Dae-won, head of the rival Jade Fang network, circled in red on a printed org chart with the words "confirmed authorization" written beneath it in his mother's handwriting. Tae-jun sat at the foot of the table. His mother sat at the head. "We have 2 problems," she said without preamble, without acknowledgement of what had happened the previous night beyond a single sentence. Min-jun is gone, delivered with the same flat affect she might use to announce a change in supply routes. The first problem is Park Dae-won. The second problem is succession. The men around the table shifted, not visibly. These were not men who showed discomfort through their bodies, but Tae-jun had spent enough years in rooms like this to read the small tells. The slight change in breathing, the way 3 of them glanced, briefly and carefully in his direction. Succession is not a problem, said Baek Jin-ho, his mother's chief legal strategist. A thin man with steel-rimmed glasses who had spent 30 years making the syndicate's darkest transactions appear legitimate on paper. The family charter is clear on direct lineage. The charter requires a blood heir, his mother said. She did not look at Tae-jun. Min-jun had no children. The succession defaults to Tae-jun's line. Silence. Tae-jun said, I don't have a line. His mother finally looked at him. That's the second problem. He held her gaze and felt something cold settle into the back of his throat. What are you saying? I'm saying that the charter is explicit, a direct blood heir, not simply the next available male in the family, a confirmed legitimate descendant in the Kong bloodline who can be formally recognized and protected under syndicate law. She paused. Her hands were flat on the table. Tae-jun, you are 34. You have never married. You have no recognized children. Then we update the charter. We cannot update the charter without unanimous council approval, which requires 6 weeks of process, during which the organization is legally, by our own rules, in a state of contested leadership. Park Dae-won's people are watching every move we make right now. If we announce a leadership vacuum, even a temporary one, we are handing them the leverage to fracture our alliances. She leaned forward slightly. We need a blood heir, a real one who already exists and can be formally recognized. The room was very quiet. There is something you should see, said Baek Jin-ho, and he opened a manila folder and slid it down the table. Tae-jun looked down at it. Inside was a photograph. A boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, captured in what appeared to be a schoolyard. Bright sunlight, a red backpack, a wide, easy smile. The photograph was surveillance quality, taken from a distance, but even at that resolution, the resemblance was immediate and undeniable. The shape of the jaw, the particular set of the eyes, slightly wide, slightly serious beneath the warmth of the smile, the angle of the cheekbones. Tae-jun's hands did not move. He was very careful about that. His hands stayed flat on the table and he breathed once, slowly, and said nothing. His name is Malik Monroe, Baek Jin-ho said, his voice professionally neutral, as though he were reading from an invoice. Age 10, Baltimore, Maryland. His mother is Dr. Nia Monroe, formerly Nia Monroe, medical student. She was in Seoul from 2013 to 2015 on an academic exchange scholarship. A pause. Our investigators confirmed the timeline. The genetic probability is... Stop, Tae-jun said. The word came out quiet. Not loud, not sharp. Just a single flat syllable that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Baek Jin-ho stopped. Kang Soo-yeon looked at her son with an expression that was not unkind so much as entirely without sentimentality. You knew, she said. It was not a question. This conversation is over, Tae-jun said. He pushed back his chair. Tae-jun, I said it's over. If you walk out of this room without addressing what's in that folder, his mother said, her voice dropping to something very low and very controlled, then by tonight I will have authorized direct contact with the woman and the child independently, without you in the room, without your voice in the process. Is that what you want? He stopped. His hand was on the back of the chair. He did not turn around. Sit down, she said. He sat down. Was. He had met Nia Monroe on an October afternoon in 2013 in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Yonsei University, which was not the kind of place Kang Tae-jun typically spent his time. He had been there because of a meeting, a contact who used the location specifically because it was full of foreign students and academics, and therefore the last place anyone would expect to find syndicate business being transacted. And the meeting had ended early, and he had been waiting for his driver, and she had sat down at the table next to him and immediately knocked her bag off the chair and sent an entire semester's worth of annotated medical flashcards cascading across the floor. He had helped her pick them up. That was it. That was the whole beginning. She had looked at him with those dark eyes, direct, slightly exasperated at herself, not remotely intimidated by the suit or the posture or the carefully cultivated distance he wore like armor, and said in accented but completely confident Korean, I have been in this country for 6 weeks, and this is the third time I've done that exact thing. I'm starting to think the universe is trying to communicate something. He had said in English, probably to get a better bag. She had blinked. Then she had laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded. The kind that didn't calculate its own effect. And something in his chest had done something he was not prepared for and did not have a name for. He had missed his driver. He had stayed another 2 hours. He had told her his name was June. He had told her he worked in finance. Both things were true, in the broadest technical sense, which was enough for a first conversation. He had not expected a second one. He had not expected to think about her for the following 3 days with an intensity that felt structurally out of proportion to a 2-hour coffee shop encounter. He had gone back to the same coffee shop the following Thursday. She had been there. She had looked up from her textbooks and said, "Finance guy," and moved her bag so there was room at her table, and he had sat down and stayed until closing. By December, they were meeting 3 times a week. By January, it was more. By February, he had stopped pretending to himself that this was anything other than what it was. The problem, the fundamental, load-bearing problem that Tae-jun had circled for months before forcing himself to look at directly, was that Nia Monroe was not a complication that could be managed. She was not a distraction, not a phase, not a temporary deviation from the life already planned for him. She was Nia, and Nia was specific in ways that made his usual strategies useless. She asked questions, not naively, not with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone who didn't know they were standing next to something dangerous, but with the focused precision of a person trained to diagnose, to identify the symptom beneath the symptom. She noticed the things he left out. She noticed when his answers were architecturally too clean. She had a way of looking at him while he was talking that made him feel, with uncomfortable regularity, that she was seeing something behind his eyes that he hadn't consciously shown her. "You're careful," she told him one night in his apartment, the private one in Itaewon, not the main residence, the one he had never brought anyone to before. Lying on her back on his couch, with a pathophysiology textbook open on her chest and her shoes already off. "Careful like you've been taught to be, not like you were born that way." He looked up from his phone. "What's the difference? Born careful people are afraid of the wrong move. Taught careful people are afraid of being known." She turned a page without looking at him. "You're the second kind." He hadn't answered that. He hadn't been able to. She had looked at him then, sideways, not confrontational, just honest, and said, "I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I'm just telling you I can see the parts you're not telling me. That's different." He had set his phone down. "What if what you see is worse than you think it is?" he said. The words came out flatter than he intended, more serious. She had considered that for a moment, long enough that he knew she was actually thinking it through and not just offering reassurance. "Then I guess we'd have to figure out if the rest of it is worth it," she said. That night he had stayed awake long after she fell asleep, watching the ceiling and understanding clearly and without comfort that he was in serious trouble. By spring of 2014, he was living a split existence that he had constructed with careful precision and was beginning to feel the structural weight of. There was the syndicate version of his life. Meetings, operations, the steady accumulation of power and responsibility that came with being Kang Tae-jun, the second son, the enforcer, the man his brother depended on to solve the problems that couldn't be solved through legitimate channels. There was his mother, who had noticed that he was less available than he had been and had said nothing about it yet, which meant she was watching and gathering information, which was always more dangerous than when she spoke. And then there was the Nia version, the version of himself that existed in her presence, which was something he had not anticipated and couldn't fully account for. He was not, in that version, a man who had done the things he had done. He was not reconstructing himself for her benefit, not performing a softened character to keep her close. It was more uncomfortable than performance. It was more like, when he was with her, the other version of him receded. Not disappeared, not erased, but receded far enough that he could breathe in a way he had forgotten was possible. He knew it wasn't sustainable. He knew it with the same clarity he knew the load capacity of structural steel, not as an opinion, but as a fact, obvious to anyone with sufficient information about how the weight was distributed. He just hadn't figured out yet what to do about it. In the meantime, he stayed. She told him she was pregnant on a Tuesday evening in September of 2014 in his Itaewon apartment, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, not defensively, he would realize later, but the way she crossed them when she was preparing to be honest about something hard. She said it directly. That was Nia's way. No softening entrance, no extended preamble, just the fact, delivered clearly with her eyes on his face. "I'm pregnant," she said. He stood very still. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of something simmering on the stove. She cooked when she was stressed, had been doing it for the past hour while he watched without understanding what she was working through. And the rain outside and the hum of the refrigerator. He said nothing for long enough that she added quietly, "I know." He looked at her. "You know what? I know this is the part where things get complicated." Her voice was steady, not hard. Steady. The way she was when she was managing her own fear by keeping her voice level. He recognized it because he did the same thing. "I'm not telling you to panic. I'm telling you because you have the right to know, and because I don't operate by leaving people in the dark about things that affect them." She paused. "What I do with this is my decision. I'm not asking you to make it. I'm just asking you to be honest with me about where you are." He should have said something then. He understood later with absolute clarity that the next 30 seconds contained the entire weight of everything that followed. If he had opened his mouth and said the true thing, which was terrifying but available, which was that he was in love with her, that he had been for months, that the idea of losing her made him feel something that no amount of professional distance could neutralize. If he had said that, the story would have been different. Instead, what happened inside him was a sound like machinery locking down. Every survival instinct he had spent 34 years sharpening came online simultaneously, drowning out everything else. The syndicate, his mother, the charter, the bloodline, the thousand ways this, a foreign woman, a pregnancy, an unsanctioned relationship, would be received by the organization he had spent his life serving and the mother who ran it. He thought about Min-jun, his brother, and what Min-jun would say. He thought about his mother's face. He said, "I need some time to think." Nia looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face. Not hurt, not yet. Something more like recognition, the quiet, devastating click of a diagnosis confirmed. And she nodded once and picked up her bag and left. He thought for 3 weeks. Or rather, he did not think. He negotiated with himself, which was different, and he knew it was different. And that knowledge made him furious in the way that all accurate self-assessments did. He ran scenarios. He calculated outcomes. He turned the thing over from every angle, looking for the version where it worked, where the syndicate and the relationship and the pregnancy and his mother and the life he had built could coexist in the same architecture without the whole thing collapsing. There wasn't one. He had known from the first 5 minutes there wasn't one. He ran the scenarios anyway because it was easier than admitting that the decision had already been made for him by the structure of everything he had allowed himself to become. His mother found out in week 2. He never discovered exactly how. One of his men, he suspected, or one of hers, which amounted to the same thing. What he came home to one evening was Kang Soo-yeon sitting in his living room with a cup of tea and an expression that could have meant anything and therefore meant everything. She said, "Tell me the situation," he told her, flatly, without softening, because that was the language she spoke, and he had no energy left for anything else. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her teacup balanced on her knee, and then she said, with perfect controlled evenness, "She cannot be part of this family." "I know. The child, if it exists, I know. Then you know what needs to happen." He looked at his mother and felt something inside him that was old and tired and had been fighting a long time sit down and stop fighting. "I'll handle it," he said. He didn't handle it himself. That was the particular cowardice at the center of everything, that he didn't face her. He sent Baek Jin-ho and his mother together to Nia's apartment near the university with a legal document, a settlement figure that was designed to be too large to refuse, and a confidentiality agreement that erased the child from syndicate records in exchange for financial security for life. He sat in his office and watched the clock while it happened. When Baek Jin-ho called to say that Dr. Monroe had read the document, set it on the table without comment, and asked them to leave, that she had refused to sign anything, refused to accept anything, and had shown them to the door with a politeness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. He felt a specific kind of relief, the kind that only arrives when you've done something irreversible and there's nothing left to do but live with it. He called her that evening. She picked up on the third ring. "Naya, you don't have to explain," she said. Her voice was very quiet, completely level. "I understand what happened. I want you to know that." He held the phone and breathed. "It's better this way," he said. The sentence came out of him the way trained responses come out, automatically, without deliberation, the words that fit the shape of the exit he had already committed to. Silence on the line. "Okay," she said. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. The single syllable of a woman closing a door very carefully instead of slamming it because she had too much dignity for the other option. The line went dead. He set his phone on the desk and sat in his office for a long time, not moving, not thinking, doing the thing that the next 10 years would teach him to do with terrible efficiency. He buried it, packed it down into the same dark internal space where he put everything he couldn't afford to carry, sealed it with the same discipline that had built him into the person he was, and went back to work. The years that followed were, by any external measure, a success. Tae-jun rose through the syndicate with a speed that surprised even his mother, though she never said so. He was effective in ways that Min-jun had never quite been. More adaptable, less attached to tradition for tradition's sake, capable of reading a room the way Nia had once read him, which was a painful irony he acknowledged once and then refused to acknowledge again. By 2018, he had consolidated 3 regional alliances that had been fractious for years. By 2020, the Black Serpent's revenue through legitimate business channels had doubled. By 2022, his name was spoken in certain circles with a particular kind of respect that existed at the far edge of fear. He did not marry. His mother raised the subject 4 times. He deflected 4 times with the kind of controlled patience that communicated, without room for misunderstanding, that this was not a conversation he was prepared to have. Eventually, she stopped raising it, which meant she had filed it under future problem, which meant it would return at the worst possible time. He did not allow himself to search for information about Nia Monroe or the child that may or may not exist, because searching meant knowing, and knowing meant the thing he had buried would have to be looked at again. And he was not ready to do that. He understood this about himself as a structural weakness. He accepted it the way you accept a scar. Not with peace, exactly, but with the knowledge that it's there and it's not changing and you've learned to move around it. Occasionally in the private apartment in Itaewon, which he still kept, which was the one concession he made to whatever the 10 years before had meant to him, he would wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and feel the weight of the thing he had locked away pressing against the inside of the door. He never opened it. He got up, made coffee, went back to work. Net. Min-jun was killed on a Wednesday in March. The bullet was a professional job. Single round, silenced, from a building across the street. His brother had been walking toward the hotel entrance, not walking away from it, which meant someone had mapped his schedule down to the minute. Tae-jun had received the call at 11:47 p.m., 37 seconds after the shot, which meant the shooter had reported immediately to whoever was waiting for confirmation. Park Dae-won. He had known before the investigators confirmed it. The Jade Fang network had been expanding its position in 3 of the syndicate's key territories for 18 months, and Park had been patient about it. Patient in the way that professional predators are patient, which is to say not patient at all, but strategically timed. He had waited for the right moment. He had created the right moment. And now there was a photograph in a manila folder on a conference table in Mapogu, and Tae-jun was sitting in front of it, and the door that had held for 10 years was doing something he had not expected. It was starting to give. After the council meeting, he went to the private apartment and sat in the dark for a long time. He did not turn on the lights. He poured 2 inches of whiskey, set it on the coffee table, and did not drink it. Outside, Seoul hummed and glittered below the windows. Rain again. The city that had been the entire world of his early 30s, the geography of everything that mattered before he chose what mattered. The photograph was not in his possession. He had not taken it from the folder. He didn't need it. The image was already somewhere behind his eyes with a permanence that had arrived in approximately 4 seconds and would not, he understood, be relocating. Malik Monroe, age 10, Baltimore, Maryland. He did the arithmetic the way he had been doing it for 3 weeks without knowing he was doing it, unconsciously, since the moment Minjun's death had created the conditions in which his past could no longer remain past, and the arithmetic was precise and without mercy. The timeline matched exactly. The resemblance was not a question of probability or interpretation. The shape of that jaw was the shape of his jaw, the set of those eyes. His son. He had a son. He had always had a son. That was the part that the next 10 years had been built on top of, unknowingly or knowingly, depending on how honest he was willing to be at 3 in the morning in the dark. He picked up the whiskey and drank it and set the glass down and looked at the ceiling, and the thing that had lived behind the door for 10 years came through it completely, for the first time. And there was nothing left to do but feel it. He had been 24 years old, and he had been afraid, and he had made the most catastrophic decision of his life in less time than it takes to boil water. And then he had spent a decade becoming powerful enough that no one could touch him. And none of it, not one achievement, not one expansion, not one alliance sealed, not one enemy broken, had done a single thing about the wait. He already knew what his mother was going to do. She would initiate contact through official channels. She would use the syndicate's legal team and the settlement offer that had been refused once, and calculate, correctly, that 10 years changed the arithmetic of what was acceptable, that a woman who had built a life on her own terms might now feel differently about the resources being offered. She would be professional about it. She would be strategic. She would reduce Nia Monroe to a variable in a succession equation and send men in suits to Baltimore with documents and timelines. He also knew what he was going to do. He was going to go first. Not with lawyers, not with a settlement. Not with his mother's script or the syndicate's paperwork or the formal recognition offer that Baek Jin-ho had been drafting since last week. He was going to go to Baltimore, and he was going to sit across from the woman he had destroyed with a phone call, and he was going to do the thing he had been too afraid to do for 10 years. He was going to face her. Whether she let him through the door was another question entirely. He suspected, knowing Nia Monroe, that she would. Not because she'd forgiven him, not because she wanted anything from him, but because Nia Monroe had never, in the entire time he had known her, chosen the easier option when the harder one was the honest one. He pulled out his phone, booked the first available flight to Baltimore. Then he sat in the dark for another hour and thought about a boy with a red backpack and his own jaw and a wide, easy smile, standing in a Baltimore schoolyard in a photograph taken by a syndicate investigator, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 10 years tear itself open. He didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning, he picked up his jacket, left the apartment, and walked out into the Seoul rain. The flight was in 6 hours. Whatever waited for him in Baltimore, the woman who had refused his money, the son who didn't know he existed, the reckoning that 10 years of silence had been building compound interest on, he was going to meet it standing up. For the first time since a Tuesday evening in September 2014, Kang Tae-jun allowed himself to think her name without shutting it down. Nia. He walked through the rain and felt the word settle into the space it had always occupied. The one he had worked so hard to seal, and understood that the sealing had never been as complete as he had told himself. It had just been waiting. The flight from Incheon to Baltimore, Washington took 14 hours and 20 minutes, and Tae-jun spent most of it awake. He had a private cabin at the front of the plane. His security team had booked it that way. Standard protocol. The kind of operational habit that had become so automatic he barely registered it anymore. The seat converted to a flat bed that he didn't use. There was a meal he didn't eat. There was a bottle of water he finished slowly over the first 3 hours while staring at nothing in particular and running through every version of the conversation that waited for him on the other side of the Atlantic. None of the versions were good. He had not told his mother he was going. That was going to be a problem, and he knew it, and he had made the calculation anyway. That arriving in Baltimore before Kang Soo-yeon's people made contact was more important than the argument that was going to happen when she found out he had moved unilaterally. He had sent one message to Baek Jin-ho. Hold all contact with the Monroe situation. Nothing moves until I say so. Baek Jin-ho had responded 17 minutes later with a single line. Your mother has already been informed of your departure. Then nothing. Which meant his mother was waiting. Which meant the clock was already running. He closed his eyes somewhere over the Pacific and tried to construct the opening sentence. The first thing he would say when she opened the door, if she opened the door. He built it and dismantled it and built it again, and every version sounded like either an excuse or a performance, and Niall Monroe had spent 10 years building a life that had no use for either. He gave up on the sentence somewhere over Canada. He watched the darkness outside the window and thought instead about the boy in the photograph, the red backpack, the way the smile reached his eyes in a way that Taejun's own smile, the syndicate smile, the one he wore for rooms and cameras and negotiations, never quite did. He thought about what a 10-year-old boy in Baltimore knew about his father, and the answer that came back was the one he deserved. Nothing, or nothing good. The plane landed at BWI at 6:42 in the morning, local time. Gray sky. March cold that felt different from Seoul cold, wetter, heavier, the kind that gets into your coat rather than just sitting on top of it. His security detail, 2 men, Park and Choi, who had been with him long enough to move without being told, flanked him through customs with the efficient invisibility of people who had done this 100 times in 100 airports. He had the address. His team had pulled it from the investigator's original report, a house in a neighborhood called Waverly, which the report had described as a working to middle-class residential area, majority black, close to a good elementary school and a public library. The report had been clinical about it, the way syndicate intelligence always was, reducing a life to its coordinates. He had read it twice and felt the clinical language like a specific kind of accusation. She had built a real life. That was what the report said, underneath its coordinates and its surveillance photographs. She had built something real and solid and entirely her own. He had spent 10 years building an empire, and she had spent 10 years building a home, and he was acutely, uncomfortably aware of which one of those things was harder. The car stopped on a tree-lined street at 8:15 in the morning. The house was a brick row house, narrow and well-maintained, with a small front step and a door painted a dark green that was either very deliberately chosen or had been that color when she moved in and she hadn't changed it. There were lights on inside. A child's bicycle was chained to the front railing, dark blue, a little mud splattered, the kind of mud that comes from actually using a bike and not just owning one. Taejun sat in the car for a moment. Park, in the front seat, said nothing. Choi, beside him, said nothing. They had both been with him long enough to know when silence was the correct response. He got out of the car. He walked to the door and he stood in front of it, and he raised his hand and knocked. 3 times. Not hard. Not soft. The knock of a person who has decided to be here and is now committed to being here regardless of what happens next. Silence inside. Then footsteps. Quick. Light. Not the footsteps of someone who had been warned, not the footsteps of someone moving cautiously, just someone walking to their front door on a Wednesday morning. The door opened. Niall Monroe stood in the doorway in scrubs, dark blue, the kind worn under lab coats, with a coffee mug in one hand and her hair pulled back and her eyes, when they landed on his face, going through a sequence of responses so fast he could barely track them. Shock. Recognition. Something beneath the recognition that was harder to read and more important. She did not say his name. She said, "How did you find this address?" Not a question, a statement of understanding. She already knew the answer, was simply confirming that she knew it. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I know why you're here." She looked past him briefly, registered the car, the 2 men, the whole apparatus of who he had become, and then looked back at him with an expression that was not fear and not anger, but something that had been tempered over a long time into something more durable than either. "You have 5 minutes to convince me to let you inside. After that, I'm going to be late for a shift. I'm not here with a settlement agreement." "Then what are you here with?" He held her gaze, said it directly, because it was the only currency she had ever accepted from him. "An apology." Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to tell him it landed somewhere real. 5 minutes starts now," she said, and stepped back from the door. Get. The inside of the house was exactly what he would have predicted, and nothing like what the syndicate's intelligence report had made it feel like. It was warm, not performatively warm, not decorated for the sake of appearances, but genuinely, functionally warm in the way of a place where someone has been actually living for years. Books on shelves and stacked on end tables. A child's drawing taped to the refrigerator. He could see it from the doorway. A figure in blue crayon that might have been a doctor or a superhero, possibly both. Shoes by the door, small ones beside larger ones. She did not offer him coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter with her mug and watched him stand in the middle of her living room with the same direct, diagnostic attention she had always given him, and waited. He said, "I know what the syndicate wants." "I know what they want too. Your mother sent a man to my workplace 3 days ago." She said it without heat, just information. He was very polite. He gave me a card and told me someone would be in touch. I threw the card away. Something moved through his chest. 3 days ago. His mother had moved faster than he had accounted for. "She doesn't speak for me," he said. "She spoke for you 10 years ago just fine." The sentence arrived in the room and sat there. He didn't deflect it. He let it land where it was going to land. "Yes," he said. "She did. And I let her." Naya looked at him for a moment. The directness in her eyes hadn't changed in 10 years. If anything, it had intensified, sharpened. The way everything about her seemed more distilled now, more precisely herself. "What do you actually want, Taejun?" "I want to—" He stopped, restarted. "I owe you an honest conversation, not a legal process, not an offer, just the thing I should have had with you 10 years ago." "The thing you should have had with me 10 years ago was telling me to my face instead of sending your mother with a contract." Her voice was level, not raised. The level voice was worse. "I had to sit across a table from that woman while she explained very professionally why my child was an inconvenience to your family's business interests." He felt the words the way you feel something that you've known intellectually for a long time but haven't let yourself fully imagine. The picture of it, specifically. Nia, pregnant, sitting across from Kang Soo-yeon, what that room must have felt like. What Nia's face must have looked like while she maintained her dignity against a woman who was trying to purchase her silence. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are." She set her coffee mug down on the counter. "That's not the same as it being enough." "I know it's not enough." "Then what are we doing here?" He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a man who has rehearsed this conversation for 14 hours on a plane and has arrived at the moment of it and found that all the rehearsal was insufficient. "My brother was killed. The syndicate has a succession issue. My family's charter requires a blood heir and—" "I know," she said. "The polite man who came to my workplace explained some of it." A pause. "I want you to hear me say this very clearly. Malik is not a succession solution. He is not an heir to anything. He is a 10-year-old boy who has a life and a school and friends and a mother who has spent a decade making sure that whatever you chose doesn't define how he sees himself. I'm not here to take him. Then what are you here for?" "I told you, I'm here to apologize." "You said that." She crossed her arms. Not the defensive cross, the thinking cross. The one he remembered from years of watching her process complicated things on her feet. An apology that arrives 10 years late and 2 weeks after your family's succession crisis is not just an apology. You understand that, right? It looks like something else. "I know how it looks." "Do you?" He looked at her straight. "It looks like a man who spent 10 years being a coward finally running out of road. Yeah, I know exactly how it looks." That landed differently. He could see it. Not softening, nothing as simple as that, but something adjusting in her expression. A recalibration. "You have a son," she said quietly. Not as an accusation this time, just a fact placed between them. "I know. He's extraordinary." She said it the way parents say things about their children when they've spent years watching them become, with a fullness that was its own kind of grief, directed at him because he had missed it. He reads at 3 grade levels above his class. He taught himself to play chess from a library book. Last month he spent 2 weeks building a model of the human circulatory system for a science project because he wanted to understand what I do at work. She paused. "He has your jaw. I look at it every day." Taejun said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. There was only the weight of it, pressing down on every part of him that had spent 10 years not feeling it. "What does he know?" he asked finally. "About me." He knows his father exists. He knows I loved him once. He knows it didn't work out. She picked up her mug, set it down again. He has never once asked me to speak badly about you. I don't know if that's the best or the hardest thing about him. And the sound of footsteps on stairs changed everything. They both heard it at the same time, quick, descending, the particular rhythm of a child who takes stairs two at a time and hasn't yet developed an adult self-consciousness about noise. Nia turned toward the hallway. Taejun turned. His chest did something he had no framework for. Malik Monroe appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was bigger than the photograph. Or rather, the photograph had flattened him into 2 dimensions, and standing here, he was 3-dimensional and immediate and entirely real. He wore a school uniform, half assembled, shirt tucked in, tie loose, 1 shoe on and 1 in his hand. He had Nia's energy and Taejun's bone structure, and a face that was doing the completely guileless thing that only children can do, which was to take in a stranger in his living room with direct curiosity and zero performance of any kind. "Mom, I can't find my—" He stopped, looked at Taejun, looked at his mother, back at Taejun. "Sorry, I didn't know someone was here." "It's okay, baby," Nia said, and her voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but differently focused, the way a person's voice changes when they're protecting something. "Go finish getting ready. I'll be right up." Malik looked at Taejun one more time. The look was not unfriendly. It was assessing, that same diagnostic quality Nia had, already present in a 10-year-old, already filtering and calculating. Then he nodded, the way a child nods when they've decided to be polite about a situation they haven't fully decoded yet, and disappeared back up the stairs. The room was quiet again. Taejun became aware that he was not breathing normally. Nia was watching him. Her expression had closed slightly, not against him specifically, but protectively, in the direction of the stairs. "You need to leave before he comes back down," she said. Not unkindly, flatly. "Nia, I mean it. He doesn't know who you are, and that is not a conversation I'm having in the next 7 minutes before the school bus comes. You don't get to show up here and have that conversation happen by accident because you didn't call first." He nodded. He understood that. He respected it, even. "Can I call you?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, turned back. "He's—" The sentence didn't complete itself easily. He tried again. "He seems like—" "He's everything," Nia said. Simple. Absolute. "He's everything, and he got there without you. Remember that." He left. He sat in the car on her street and didn't tell Park to drive for several minutes. Through the windshield, the brick row houses stood in a row in the gray March light. Ordinary, permanent, the kind of solidity that gets built out of years of consistent presence, which was the one thing he had never provided to anything in this zip code. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His mother. He let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He looked at the screen for a moment, then put the phone face down on the seat beside him. Park glanced in the rear-view mirror, said nothing. The phone buzzed again. Text this time. He turned it over. "I know where you are. Come home. This is not how we handle this." He typed back. "I'll be in touch." She responded in under 10 seconds. "Vic is already in contact with a family attorney in Maryland. If you won't do this properly, I will." He stared at that. There it was. His mother, moving the pieces while he sat on a street in Baltimore, having not accomplished anything except standing in a woman's living room and watching his son come down the stairs with 1 shoe on. The syndicate's legal machinery was already turning. Baek Jin-ho, family attorneys, the formal recognition process, which was not, whatever language it dressed itself in, actually about recognition. It was about acquisition. The syndicate needed an heir, and the syndicate was going to move toward that heir with all the institutional momentum of an organization that had been moving toward things for 60 years, and had not yet encountered a thing it couldn't eventually redirect toward its own purposes. He called Baek Jin-ho. Baek picked up on the second ring. "Director Kang, tell me what my mother authorized." A pause. Brief. "I'm not in a position to—" "Jin-ho." Another pause. The sound of a door closing on the other end of the line, wherever Baek was. Soul still, from the background noise. She authorized me to engage a Maryland family law firm to initiate formal paternity documentation proceedings, Beck said, with the particular flatness he used when he was delivering information he expected to cause problems. The intent is to create a legal record of Malik Monroe's status as a Kang blood heir before any informal arrangement can be reached. It protects the syndicate's position if what? If Dr. Monroe decides to take this public. Or if the child, when he's older, contests the recognition. Beck paused. It's a protective measure. It's a preemptive strike, Taijun said. It's my mother putting a legal claim on a 10-year-old boy whose mother has spent a decade keeping him away from exactly this kind of thing. Silence. Halt it, Taijun said. Director Kang, your mother has equal authority on internal matters during the succession interim. I said halt it, Jinho. Tell her I said so. Tell her I'm handling this directly, and if she moves on this without my consent, I will consider it a formal challenge to my succession claim and respond accordingly. He said it without raising his voice. That was something he had learned from his mother, actually. The thing said at room temperature that cut deepest. She wants an heir. The only path to that heir goes through me. Make sure she understands that. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll convey the message, Beck said. He hung up. He looked out the window at Nia's front door. The green paint. The blue bicycle chained to the railing. The light still on inside. She didn't know what had just been set into motion. She had thrown away a business card and said she'd think about whether he could call. And meanwhile, the organization responsible for the most important thing that had ever happened in her life was deploying its legal infrastructure in her direction, like a slow-moving ship that didn't need to be fast because it was large enough. He needed her to know, not because it would make her trust him, not because it would make the apology land differently, or fix any of the things that had been broken since a September evening in 2014. He needed her to know because she had built her entire life on the principle of having accurate information and making her own decisions from it. And what was coming for her was the precise opposite, a process designed to reduce her options before she understood what her options were. He got out of the car again. He walked back to the green door and knocked. This time there was a longer pause before the footsteps. She was checking, he understood, looking through the peephole or the window, making sure it was him and not someone else, which was a habit born of 10 years of being a single woman alone with a child and knowing that the world contained things that needed to be checked before opening doors. The door opened. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprised but wasn't pleased either. What? She said. My mother has already engaged a family law firm here in Maryland, he said. Directly, no preamble. They're moving toward formal paternity documentation without your knowledge or consent. You need to know that. Her face did something complex. The layers of it, processing the information, running its implications, arriving at the implications faster than most people would have, visible for just a second before her expression settled into something that was very controlled and very cold. Say that again, she said. He said it again. She was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Then she said in a voice that was almost completely flat, "Get inside." The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes and was nothing like the one he had been rehearsing. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing about Nia Monroe that he had never stopped understanding, even across 10 years of distance. She was most dangerous when she was quietest. She sat across from him at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on his face, and she asked questions with the methodical precision of a diagnostician working through a case, and he answered them, all of them, without evasion. What exactly had his mother authorized? When? Through which firm? What the formal documentation process would involve? What it would mean legally for Malik's status? What it would mean for her parental authority? What the syndicate intended beyond the documentation? He answered everything. He kept nothing back. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. So what you're telling me, she said, is that the same family that tried to write my son out of existence 10 years ago is now trying to write him in, without asking him, without asking me, because their succession structure requires a blood heir, and my son is the available blood heir. Yes. And you're sitting in my kitchen telling me this because you deserve to know before it happens to you. She looked at him across the table. Her jaw was tight. Her hands on the table were very still. You understand, she said carefully, That you being the one to tell me this doesn't make you the good guy in this situation. I know. You understand that even if your mother is the one pushing this, you're the reason any of it is possible. You're the reason there's a file with my son's name and address and school schedule in a syndicate intelligence report. You're the reason he exists in their system at all. Yes, he said. I know that. She stood up, moved to the window, stood there with her back to him, looking out at the narrow backyard, and he could see from the set of her shoulders the particular quality of her anger. Not explosive, not the kind that wanted to throw things, but the cold, burning kind that sits in the bones and doesn't leave. I need you to leave, she said, and I need you to understand that whatever you think you're doing by coming here and telling me this, whatever you think it means for how I see you, it doesn't change what you are. It doesn't change what you come from. And it absolutely does not change the fact that my son's life is not a piece in your family's game. He stood. I know. Then go. He went to the door, his hand on the frame again, the same position as before, the same pause. Nia. He said her name, and it came out the way it used to, before he had trained himself not to say it. She didn't turn around. I'm going to try to stop this. My mother's process. I can't promise I can, but I'm going to try. She didn't answer. He walked out, and the green door closed behind him, and this time it closed with a particular finality. Not a slam, just a solid click of the latch that sounded exactly like the future arriving. His phone was ringing again as he reached the car. He looked at the screen. Not his mother this time. Baek Jin-ho. He answered. Tell me, he said. Baek's voice on the line was careful in a way that meant what he was about to say was bad. The Maryland firm made contact this morning, Dr. Monroe's workplace. They left documentation. A pause. There's something else. The contact triggered a report to, there was a secondary party monitoring the situation. The Jade Fang network has a surveillance operation on your movements. They know you're in Baltimore. They know why. The cold that moved through him was professional, operational. The part of him that was still, underneath everything, the man who ran the Black Serpent's most dangerous operations. How long have they known? He said. Since you landed. He looked at the green door, the blue bicycle, the light still on inside the house. Park was already out of the car, hand inside his jacket, eyes moving. Taejun said, very quietly, get me a local security team, now. Already in motion, Baek said. But Director Kang, if Park Dae-won's people are watching this house, I know what it means. It meant that in coming to Baltimore to face something he should have faced 10 years ago, he had brought the war with him. It meant that the woman who had spent a decade building her life away from everything he was had spent the last 40 minutes sitting across from him at her kitchen table. And during those 40 minutes, the thing she had been running from had arrived at. Her door was still closed. Taejun stood on the sidewalk and looked at it and did the calculation in under 4 seconds. The kind of calculation that bypassed deliberation entirely and operated on the pure instinct of someone who had spent 15 years surviving situations where the difference between a correct and incorrect read of a room was measured in bodies. Park Dae-won's people had been watching this house, which meant they had a position somewhere on this street, which meant they had been here before him, possibly before Min-jun's funeral, possibly since the moment the syndicate's investigators had first pulled Malik Monroe's name from the records. Which meant the surveillance wasn't about Taejun's movements. It was about the boy, about the heir, about the single point of leverage that could destabilize the Black Serpent's succession and hand Park Dae-won the chaos he needed to finish what the bullet in Gangnam had started. He turned to Park. The blue sedan, end of the block, north side. Park didn't look directly at it. A slight adjustment of his angle, a half-second read. 2 occupants, engine's been running. They're not moving. No, watching. Choi had come around the car from the other side, positioning without being told. The triangulation of 3 men who had operated together long enough to move like a single organism. Taejun said, I need you to go back inside. Park looked at him. Sir, I'm going back inside. You 2 manage the street. Nobody comes within 30 meters of this house until I know what we're dealing with. He was already moving toward the door. And get me a name from those plates. He knocked. 3 times. Same rhythm as before. Longer pause this time. Then her voice muffled through the door. I said leave, Tae-jun. There's a surveillance vehicle 30 meters north of your house. 2 men. They were here before I arrived. He said it at a volume calibrated for the door and not the street. I need you to step back from the windows. Silence. The door opened. She looked at him, past him first, a quick involuntary scan of the street, and then at his face, and whatever she had been holding on to since she'd told him to go, whatever the controlled anger had been doing to the architecture of her expression, shifted into something that was closer to the bone. Not fear. Nia Monroe was not, he already knew, a woman who ran on fear, but a specific kind of alertness that he recognized because it was the same thing that happened to him when the parameters of a situation changed faster than expected. She stepped back. He came inside. He stayed near the window, angled so he could see the street without being visible from it. She stood in the middle of her living room with her arms crossed, the thinking cross, not the defensive one, and watched him. Explain, she said. The organization that killed my brother has been running surveillance on this address. Possibly on you directly. Possibly on Malik. He kept his voice level. Clinical. The same tone he used in operational briefings, because it was the tone that moved information fastest without distortion. Their interest is the succession. If they can demonstrate that the Black Serpent's heir is compromised, accessible, or unstable, it accelerates the internal fracture they've been engineering for 18 months. Compromised how? By making contact with him, by creating a situation where the syndicate appears unable to protect its own bloodline. He paused. Or by using him as direct leverage. She was very still. You're telling me my son is a target. I'm telling you he may be a target. I don't know how long they've been watching or what their operational intent is. I'm waiting on an intelligence report. You brought this here, she said. Not an accusation, a statement of causality, precise and flat. You coming here made this worse. They were already here. My coming here didn't create the surveillance. It may have accelerated their timeline. He looked at her. I'm sorry. That's accurate, and I know it doesn't help. She turned away from him, walked to the bottom of the stairs and stood there, one hand on the banister, looking up toward the sound of Malik moving around in his room. The ordinary sounds of a 10-year-old getting ready for school, completely unaware that the street outside his window had just become something different. Her hand on the banister tightened. What do I do? She said, quietly. Not to him specifically. To the situation. Right now, keep Malik home from school today. Don't explain why, just tell him you need him home. I'll have my team establish a perimeter while I get more information. After that, we need to talk about... Stop! She turned back around. Stop giving me operational instructions like I'm one of your people. I'm not one of your people. I'm his mother. She said the last word with a precision that was its own kind of force. I know that. Then talk to me like a person and not like a... She stopped, pressed 2 fingers to her temple. What do you actually know, specifically, not operationally? What do you know? His phone buzzed. He held up one finger, not dismissively, a genuine 1 second, and looked at the screen. Baek Jin-ho. He answered. Tell me about the plates. Baek's voice was tight, in a way Tae-jun hadn't heard since a very bad night in Busan 3 years ago. The vehicle is registered to a shell company linked to Jade Fang's American distribution network, but that's not why I'm calling. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him what was coming was significant. I need you to hear something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Go. The Maryland family law firm your mother engaged, Hahn and Associates. I ran a deeper background on their recent case history as part of the due diligence process. One of their senior partners, a man named David Cho, handled a significant asset transfer case 18 months ago. Another pause. The opposing counsel on that case represented Park Dae-won's legitimate holding company in the United States. The room was very quiet. Tae-jun said, Say that again. David Cho has a documented professional relationship with legal entities connected to the Jade Fang network. It is possible... I want to be precise about this. It is possible this is coincidental. They are large organizations with wide legal footprints, and shared counsel is not inherently Jin-ho. Yes. Do you believe it's coincidental? A long pause. No. Tae-jun stood very still. He was aware of Nia watching him from across the room, reading his face, already understanding from his posture that what he was hearing was not good. "Who authorized the firm?" he said. He already knew the answer. He needed to hear it said. "Your mother made the selection directly. It bypassed our standard vetting process." She cited time pressure. Beck's voice was careful now. Careful in the specific way of a man who is being scrupulously accurate because he understands that the information he is conveying may be used against him if he's anything less. "I want to be clear that I flagged the timeline as irregular when it happened. I have that documented." "I understand," Taejun said. "Don't move on anything until you hear from me." He hung up. He looked at the phone for a moment, then he put it in his pocket and looked at Nia. She said, "What happened?" "The law firm my mother hired to initiate the documentation process has a connection to the Jade Fang network." He said it without softening because there was no softer version of it, which means either my mother made a catastrophic oversight in her vetting process, or she didn't, Nia said. "Or she didn't." Silence. Nia sat down on the couch, not heavily, controlled, deliberate, the way she sat when she was loading more weight than her body wanted to carry and was managing it consciously. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the floor for a moment. "So your mother may have hired lawyers connected to the people who killed your brother," she said, "to initiate legal proceedings regarding your son, while those same people have a surveillance vehicle parked outside my house." She looked up at him. "I need you to tell me that I'm misunderstanding something." "You're not misunderstanding anything." "Taejun," her voice was very controlled, "is my son safe in this house right now?" He answered her honestly, which was the only answer he had, and the hardest one to give. "I don't know." He called Park while Nia went upstairs. "I need the perimeter tight. Nobody on this block that isn't us. The sedan, don't approach, don't engage, just make sure they know we see them." He kept his voice low. "And get me a line to Lee Sung-ho in New York." Lee Sung-ho ran the Black Serpent's East Coast operations. A compact, precise man who had been loyal to the syndicate since before Taejun was old enough to understand what loyalty in this context actually cost. "Tell him I need 4 more people here inside the hour." He heard Nia's voice upstairs, gentle, unhurried, the practiced ease of a mother explaining something ordinary to a child without the slightest tremor of what she was actually managing underneath. He couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, the particular steadiness of it. He stood in her living room and looked at the drawing taped to the refrigerator. Up close it was clearly a doctor, stethoscope around the neck, careful crayon detail on the white coat, but the figure also had what appeared to be a cape. He stood there looking at it for longer than he meant to and felt something move through him that had no tactical application whatsoever. His phone rang. Not Beck this time. Not Park. His mother. He stared at the screen through 4 rings. 5. Then he answered. "Where are you?" she said, not a greeting. "Baltimore." "I know you're in Baltimore, Taejun. I'm asking specifically where." "The Monroe House." He let that land. "I know about the firm." A pause. Short, controlled. "What about the firm?" "David Cho. His connection to Jade Fang's American legal entities." He kept his voice even. "Tell me about the vetting process." "The firm came highly recommended by Mother." Silence. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Right now. Because I'm standing in the house of the woman who is the mother of my child, and there is a Jade Fang surveillance vehicle 30 meters from this house, and I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with." He heard her exhale. It was a small sound, barely registered, but it was more than Kang Soo-yeon usually gave, more than the immovable face she presented to rooms of men who feared her usually permitted. "I needed leverage," she said. The 2 words sat in the phone call like something dropped from a height. "Leverage," he repeated. "You were moving too slowly. You were emotional about this, which is something I understand, but the syndicate cannot wait for you to process your history with this woman. The charter is explicit. The succession window is narrow. Park is positioning himself to fracture 3 of our alliances before we can stabilize leadership, and I needed—" "You used the Jade Fang firm to apply pressure to Nia," he said. Flat. Not a question. "I needed her motivated to cooperate with the process. If she understood that the documentation was happening regardless, that the legal framework was already moving, you deliberately created a situation where the people who killed Minjun have access to information about my son's location and legal status. His voice had gone very quiet. That was the thing about the things set at room temperature. They cut deepest. Do you understand what you've done? I had assurances. From who? From Jade Fang's lawyer. You had assurances from a man connected to the organization that put a bullet behind your son's ear, and you used those assurances to pressure the mother of your grandson into a legal process. He stopped, started again. Was it leverage over her, or was it something else? Was the access to their location part of an arrangement? Tell me right now. Taejun Tate, tell me. Her voice, when it came back, was different. The control was still there. His mother's control was structural, bone deep, 63 years of never letting the room see more than she intended. But something beneath it had shifted, something that might, in another person, have been described as the sound of a woman who has gone too far and knows it. The access was not intentional, she said. I did not give them the address. What I gave them was the name, through the firm, as part of the documentation process. I did not anticipate. You didn't anticipate that a criminal organization would use the name of an unprotected 10-year-old boy in Baltimore to their advantage? He said it with a precision that was its own kind of violence. You didn't anticipate that. Silence. I need to fix this, he said. And when it's fixed, you and I are going to have a different conversation about what you're authorized to do and what you are not. He paused. About whether I can trust you with anything related to my son. Ever. He hung up. His hands were not shaking. He noted that with a kind of distant awareness, that his hands were steady, that his breathing was controlled, and understood that the steadiness was not calm, but its opposite. The total compression of everything that was not immediately operational into a space he'd deal with later. There was no later yet. There was only now, and now required him to be functional. Nia came back downstairs. She looked at his face and said, "What else?" He told her. All of it. His mother's calculation, the deliberate use of the firm, the access, unintentional or not, that had placed Malik's name in Jade Fang hands. He told her clearly, completely, without mitigation. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he counted 17 seconds in his head before she spoke. She used my son as a piece, Nia said. Your mother used a 10-year-old boy as a piece in a power game. Yes. The same woman who sat across from me 10 years ago and offered me money to disappear. Yes. She stood up, moved to the window, stopped herself, remembered not to be visible, stepped back. The gesture of a person whose instincts were in conflict with the new parameters of her environment and who was adapting faster than most people would have. I need Malik out of this house, she said. I agree. I have people coming. Lee Sung-ho. I don't want your syndicate people in my son's life. Nia, right now my syndicate people are the option available to keep him safe while I work out. There is no version of this where I hand my child's safety to the organization that created the situation. Her voice cracked, not with emotion, with force, the specific crack of something very controlled applying maximum pressure. Do you understand that? I don't trust your people. I don't trust your mother. I don't trust your structure. The only reason you're still in this house is because you came back to tell me the truth, and that is the absolute minimum of what I require from anyone in my son's vicinity. He looked at her. Then tell me what you need, he said. I need you to be honest with me about something. She crossed her arms. The thinking cross. If your mother is willing to do this, if she's willing to use Malik as leverage in a succession arrangement, willing to create legal exposure through a compromised firm, willing to move on a 10-year-old boy without his parents' knowledge or consent, what does that mean for what comes next? What does it mean for what she's capable of? He held her gaze. It means, he said carefully, that my mother has decided the succession is more important than the people involved in it. Including you? He thought about that for one honest second. Possibly, he said. She absorbed that, filed it with the efficiency of someone running triage. Then, the people outside, what do they want, specifically? Destabilization. If they can create a crisis around the succession, demonstrate that the heir is inaccessible or controlled by external parties or involved in an active legal dispute. It accelerates the fracture they've been building in our alliance network. They don't necessarily need to take Malik. They need his existence to be a visible problem. Or, she said. He looked at her. Or, she said again, they take him, and suddenly the Black Serpent isn't managing a succession. It's managing a hostage situation. The air in the room changed. He said, That's an escalation that ends your organization's capacity to function for however long it takes to resolve it, during which Park Dae-won consolidates everything he needs to consolidate. She looked at him steadily. I'm a doctor. I diagnose situations. That's the worst-case scenario, and I need to know if it's possible. He said nothing for a moment. Then, yes, it's possible. Upstairs, Malik's footsteps crossed his room. The sound of a chair scraping, a drawer opening and closing. The ordinary sounds of a boy in his room on a morning that was supposed to be a school day, not knowing that the street below his window had become the edge of something. Nia turned toward the stairs, turned back. You need to call your people, she said. The ones you trust, not your mother's people, yours. And then you need to tell me exactly what the next 12 hours look like, because I am not going to sit in this house while your family's war arrives at my front door without understanding every single thing that is happening. He was already reaching for his phone when it rang in his hand. Park. He answered immediately. Report. Park's voice was clipped. The sedan moved, repositioned to the south end of the block, and there's a second vehicle, SUV, arrived 4 minutes ago, parked facing north. A pause. They're boxing the street. Taejun turned to the window, angled himself out of the sight line, looked at the edge of the frame where he could just see the south end of the block. The SUV was dark, tinted windows, engine running. How long until Lee's people arrived? He said. 40 minutes minimum. 40 minutes. He ran the geometry of it. 2 vehicles, the positions Park had described, the likely number of occupants, the distance to the nearest exit route. He ran it in under 3 seconds, and the result was not comfortable. Park, he said. Sir, if they move before Lee gets here. I know. He hung up and turned to Nia. She was already looking at him. She had read everything she needed from his face and his posture and the 43 seconds of phone call, because Nia Monroe had always been the kind of person who extracted information from things people didn't intend to broadcast. How bad? She said. He looked at her. At the stairs. At the drawing on the refrigerator. Get Malik, he said. Now. Take only what you need. We're leaving through the back. She didn't argue, didn't hesitate. Turned to the stairs and took them at a run, and he heard her voice above, Baby, come on, we're going on a little trip. Bring your backpack. Still controlled, still steady, the voice of a woman who had been protecting her son from hard truths for 10 years and was not going to stop now, not even with the walls closing in. He moved to the back of the house. The rear door opened onto a narrow yard. Fence, gate, an alley running parallel to the street. He texted Park. Back alley. Meet us at the north end, now. Then he texted Baek Jin-ho 4 words. Find out who gave them the address, yeah, not the name. The address. Someone inside gave them the specific location, and I need that name before I get on another plane. He stood at the back door and listened to Nia moving upstairs with her son, and felt the situation with the clarity of someone who had arrived at the place where there was no longer any version of this that didn't cost something significant. He had come to Baltimore to face a woman he had wronged. What he had found instead was that the wronging was still in progress. That 10 years of distance hadn't contained the damage, but only delayed it, allowed it to accrue interest, allowed it to grow in the dark into something large enough that it now threatened not just the woman he had failed, but the child born from that failure, standing in a bedroom upstairs with a backpack, about to be walked out the back of his own house by a mother who was holding everything together through sheer force of a will that Taejun had once been close enough to feel and had thrown away. Footsteps on the stairs. Both sets. Hers and the lighter, quicker ones. They came around the corner into the kitchen. Nia, with a bag over one shoulder, her keys in her hand, her face composed into the expression she wore for her son's benefit. Malik beside her, backpack on, looking at Taejun with that assessing gaze that had no name yet in the boy's understanding of the world, but would one day be identified as his father's capacity for reading a room. "Who are you?" Malik said. Directly, not rudely, just directly. Taejun looked at him. The question sat in the kitchen between all three of them with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to 6 words, and Nia's hand tightened on her bag strap, and the boy looked at him with eyes that were waiting for an honest answer and would know if he didn't give. "Who are you?" Malik said again. The question didn't waver. The boy stood in his own kitchen with his backpack straps in both hands and his eyes on Taejun's face, and waited with the particular patience of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need a second to decide whether to tell the truth. Taejun looked at him for 1 full second. Then he said, "Someone who knew your mother a long time ago. We need to move right now. Can you do that?" Malik looked at his mother. Nia gave him a single nod. The specific nod Taejun could see that carried its own private language between the two of them, the compressed communication of years. The boy turned back and said, "Okay." And that was it. No performance, no dramatics, just a 10-year-old who trusted his mother's read of a situation and moved. They went out the back door. The alley was narrow and smelled of wet concrete and old brick, the kind of alley that exists behind every row house block in Baltimore, barely wide enough for a car, lined with fence gates and trash cans and the occasional overgrown thing pushing through cracks. Taejun went first. Nia kept Malik between them, one hand lightly on his shoulder. Not gripping, not transmitting panic, just present. Park was at the north end in 40 seconds. The car was already running. Choi had repositioned to provide a visual on the mouth of the alley, hands visible, face neutral, the professional stillness of someone trained not to look like what he was. Malik looked at Choi, looked at the car, said nothing. They got in. The car moved before the door was fully closed. Taejun turned to look through the rear window. The south end of the alley stayed empty. No pursuit. Not yet. "Where are we going?" Nia said, not to Malik, to him. "Lee Sung-ho has a property 20 minutes from here. Clean, not in any of our registered holdings, used for transit situations. Nobody outside of 3 people knows it exists." He kept his voice low. Even. The car briefing voice. "We get there, we stabilize, I get more information, and we figure out next moves." "Next moves," she said. "Yes." She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Processing, assessing, containing. And then she looked at Malik, who was sitting between them, looking out the window at Baltimore moving past with the alert curiosity of a boy who has been pulled out of his ordinary morning and is cataloging everything about the extraordinary one that replaced it. "Malik," she said quietly. "I know, Mom," he said, still looking out the window. "You'll explain later." She looked at Taejun. Something moved across her face that was too complex to name and too fast to catch. He turned back to the front and watched the city. Right. Lee Sung-ho's transit property was a townhouse in a quiet section of Hampton. 2 stories, brick, indistinguishable from its neighbors. Lee himself was waiting at the door when they arrived, a compact man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that gave nothing away by default, and had to actively choose to give something when he decided to. He looked at Taejun, at Nia, at Malik, and made no visible adjustment to his expression. "Everything's set up," he said. "Secured line in the back room. I've got 2 more people coming in from DC in 90 minutes. "Good." Taejun moved inside. "I need you to run point on the external perimeter. Park and Choi have eyes on the Waverly location. Coordinate with them on whether those vehicles moved after we left." Lee nodded and disappeared. Nia took Malik to the kitchen. There was food. Lee had thought to have food there, which was the kind of operational competence that Taejun had always valued in him. And Taejun went to the back room and closed the door and stood in the quiet for exactly 15 seconds before he made the call he had been building toward since Park's voice on the phone told him the street was being boxed. Baek Jin-ho answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have the name," Taejun said. "I have a partial." Baek's voice was the tightest Taejun had ever heard it. The address went through the firm, through David Cho's office directly. The question of who gave Cho the address is, it came from inside the documentation process, from the intake paperwork. A pause.
The intake paperwork that your mother's office filed. Taejun said nothing.
I want to be precise, Beck said, because I need you to hear this clearly. I cannot confirm whether your mother knowingly provided the address to Cho with the understanding that it would reach Jade Fang. What I can confirm is that the address was in the paperwork went to Cho, and Cho's office has a communication log with a Jade Fang associate that postdates the filing by 6 hours. Another pause. The communication log is not detailed, but it exists. 6 hours, Taejun said. Yes. He stood in the back room of Lee Sung-ho's safe house and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was the same every time he ran it. 12 hours before Jade Fang's vehicles appeared on Nia's street, Baek Jin-ho had flagged the law firm as irregular. His mother had been informed. And 6 hours after the address was filed with David Cho's office, someone in Cho's network had contacted Jade Fang. His mother knew about the firm's connection before the address was filed. He had given her the benefit of the doubt. Had allowed himself because she was his mother, because she was 63 years old and had just lost her firstborn son, because there had to be some limit to what a person was capable of, even Kang Soo-yeon. The possibility that it had been a catastrophic oversight. It hadn't been an oversight. Jin-ho, he said. Yes. Is she trying to use Jade Fang to apply pressure to Nia, or is she trying to use Jade Fang to apply pressure to me? The silence that followed lasted long enough to confirm which answer was accurate before Beck said it. I think, Beck said very carefully, that she may be trying to create a situation in which you have no choice but to bring the child into the syndicate's formal protection, which requires formal recognition, which resolves the succession question on her timeline. She's engineering a threat, Taejun said, so I'll bring my son in out of the cold. That is my current assessment. I want to be clear that I know you can't confirm it. I know. He pressed 2 fingers against his eye socket, hard. What is her current position? She's at the compound. She's been calling your phone every 20 minutes. Don't pick up for her. And Jin-ho, begin compiling a full record of everything, every communication, every authorization she made, every step of the firm engagement, every document. I want it time-stamped and secured somewhere she cannot access. A beat. That's a significant action. Yes, he said. It is. He hung up and stood in the room and breathed for a moment, and then he went back to the kitchen. Malik was eating a bowl of cereal with the focused attention of a boy who applies the same seriousness to breakfast as to everything else. Nia sat across from him with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, her hands around it, her eyes going to the window and back at regular intervals. Taejun sat down at the table. Malik looked at him. Is this because of who you are? The boy said. Or because of who she is? Taejun looked at him. What do you mean? My mom's a doctor. She doesn't have people who do this. He gestured vaguely at the room, the safe house, the security, the implicit apparatus of the morning. So it's because of you. The trouble is because of you. Nia opened her mouth. No, he's right, Taejun said. He looked at the boy directly. Yes, the trouble is because of me, because of my family and what we do. Your mother has nothing to do with this. Malik considered that. He ate another spoonful of cereal with the thoughtfulness of someone filing information. Okay, he said finally. That was all. Just okay. The boy turned back to his cereal, and Taejun felt something in the vicinity of his sternum that he couldn't account for operationally and didn't try to. His phone buzzed. Lee Sung-ho. He stepped out of the kitchen. The vehicles on Waverly moved, Lee said. Both of them. They repositioned to a location we can't identify yet. Park lost them in traffic. A pause. Also, there's activity on the syndicate's internal channel. Someone accessed the succession documentation file from an external IP 30 minutes ago. The IP routes through a server in Vancouver, Taejun said. Jade Fang ran their digital operations through Canadian servers. He knew that from 3 years of intelligence reports. Yes, they have everything in the documentation file. Yes. Including the formal recognition framework. Yes. He closed his eyes for half a second, opened them. What does that give them? Lee was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man running the same calculation. If they have the formal recognition framework, they know the succession can be stabilized the moment Malik Monroe is recognized. They know what stabilization looks like, which means they know what they need to prevent, or what they need to accelerate on their own terms, Taejun said. If they can force a public recognition before we control the narrative, create a situation where Malik's existence is exposed to the press, to rival organizations, to the alliance network, they turn the succession stabilization into a liability. Everyone who might have accepted it quietly now has to respond to it publicly. Or, Lee said, or they take the boy and offer him back in exchange for syndicate concessions. That's the play I'd make, Lee said. Not coldly, just honestly. I know. He looked back at the kitchen doorway. Through it, he could see the edge of Malik's red backpack hanging on the chair. Get your people from DC to move faster. I want this location fully secured in the next 30 minutes. Understood. He went back inside. He had 17 minutes of relative stillness, which was not peace but was the closest available approximation, before Park called. They found us, Park said. 3 words. They carried the weight of everything that followed. How? Taejun said. Vehicle tracking. They put a tag on our car at Waverly before we left. We found it when Choi ran the sweep. A pause. We found it 4 minutes ago. They've had our location since we arrived. He was already moving through the house. How many? We have visual on 3 vehicles. 2 on the north approach, 1 south. Minimum 8 to 10 people based on vehicle capacity. Park's voice was controlled, which meant the situation was bad enough that control was the only available tool. Lee's 2 people from DC are still 40 minutes out. Taejun reached the kitchen doorway. Nia was already standing. She had heard something in his movement, in the change of air pressure in the house that precedes bad news, and she was on her feet with her bag in her hand and her body angled toward Malik. We have to move again, he said. How far? Far. He looked at Malik. Right now, bud. Let's go. The boy stood without a word, grabbed his backpack from the chair, looked at his mother. Back door again, Taejun said to Lee, who had appeared in the hallway with a gun visible now, no longer bothering with invisibility. We have a vehicle in the rear garage, Lee said. Different plates. Not in any of our systems. How long to clear the alley? 90 seconds. Go. They moved. The house was small enough that moving through it was fast. Kitchen, rear hallway, door to the attached garage, the smell of oil and cold concrete. A dark sedan already idling. Lee's man in the driver's seat, Park coming in through the side access, pulling the garage door manually. Taejun put Nia and Malik in the back. Got in the front. North. Route 83. Move. The garage door opened. The car pulled out. They made it 4 blocks. The black SUV came from a side street on the left. Not fast, no screaming acceleration, just a deliberate cut across their path that forced the driver to brake hard. Nia's hand shot out across Malik's chest, pure reflex, the same motion she had probably made 100 times in cars over 10 years without anyone threatening them. The boy grabbed her arm. 2 men out of the SUV before it fully stopped. Not running, walking, which was worse. Walking meant confident. Walking meant they had the geometry already worked out. Park's voice in Taejun's ear. Second vehicle behind us. We're boxed. Taejun looked at the 2 men in front of the car. Looked at the driver, looked at his hands. He had a weapon. He always carried. It was as automatic as breathing. But there were 8 to 10 of them, and 3 of him. And Nia and Malik were in the back seat, and the only calculation that mattered was the one where both of them walked away from this street. One of the men in front raised a hand. Not a weapon. A phone. On the phone's screen, visible even through the windshield at this distance because it was being deliberately displayed, was a face Taejun recognized. Park Dae-won. Taejun got out of the car. Taejun, Nia's voice from the back seat. Stay in the car, he said. Not harshly. Stay with Malik. Lock the door. He heard the locks engage. He walked toward the man with the phone, stopped 3 feet away, looked at the screen. Park Dae-won was in his 50s, which meant he had been in this industry long enough to understand that the most effective violence was the kind you never had to commit. He had a broad face and the particular ease of a man conducting a conversation on his own terms, which he clearly believed he was. Director Kang, he said, through the phone. His English was accented but precise. You've had an eventful morning. What do you want? Tai-jun said. What I've always wanted. What your brother's death made available. He smiled slightly. A conversation about the future of certain arrangements that your family has made complicated by its recent instability. You killed my brother. I created an opportunity. Your brother's death was the mechanism, not the goal. He paused. The goal is what's sitting in that car behind you. Not to take him, Director Kang. I want to be very clear about that. A 10-year-old boy is not something I need. What I need is his existence to remain in question long enough for our respective networks to reach a new equilibrium. You want to delay the succession. I want to delay the succession, Park agreed. 3 months. Long enough for certain alliances in your network to reconsider their positions. Long enough for the natural consequences of instability to redistribute some operational territory. He tilted his head slightly. In exchange, the boy and his mother go home. This morning becomes nothing. Nobody gets hurt. You have time to manage your family's internal situation, which I understand has become complicated, and we reach an understanding like civilized people. Tae-jun looked at the phone screen, looked at the men on either side of him, looked at the car behind him, at the darkened rear window where he knew Nia was sitting with Malik, where Malik was probably doing that thing he did, reading the situation, cataloging, filing. And if I say no, Tae-jun said. Park's expression didn't change. Then this morning becomes complicated for everyone, and I would genuinely prefer it not to. A pause. You came here to do something right. I can see that. You came here to face something you walked away from. I have to admit I find it almost admirable. But this is not a situation that rewards sentiment, Director Kang. It rewards calculation. 3 months, Tae-jun said. 3 months of public ambiguity about succession. No formal recognition, no announcement, no legal proceedings. Handled quietly. Internally. Park spread his hands in a gesture of generosity. After which, whatever you decide about your family situation is your own business. The street was very quiet. The March cold had gotten into Tai-jun's coat the way Baltimore cold did. From inside rather than outside, settling into the bones. He was aware of every point of physical contact between himself and the ground beneath his feet, aware of his own breathing, aware of the specific quality of the silence from the car behind him, which was the silence of two people trying not to make any sound at all. He thought about 3 months. He thought about what 3 months meant. 3 months of the syndicate in open succession instability, 3 months of alliance partners reconsidering their positions, 3 months of Park Dae-won quietly consolidating the ground he needed. He thought about what the organization looked like on the other side of 3 months of that, and the picture was not one the syndicate survived intact. He also thought about his mother, who had engineered this situation, who had placed Malik's address in the hands of a compromised firm and then allowed the subsequent crisis to unfold in a way that left Tai-jun with a set of options, all of which led back to the syndicate, to recognition, to the succession being resolved on her terms. She had calculated that the crisis would force his hand. She had been right about the crisis. She had been wrong about which hand it would force. He looked at Park Dae-won's face on the phone screen. Counteroffer, he said. Park raised an eyebrow. You get 6 weeks, not 3 months. 6 weeks of public ambiguity while I manage the internal process. He paused. In exchange, you tell me everything you know about the communication between David Cho's office and your network, every detail, every contact, every communication in the log. Park was quiet for a moment. That's an unusual counter, he said. It's a specific one. You want time. I want information about how my mother's office connected to your network. Those two things are not in conflict. He looked at the man directly. Unless they are. Unless the information about David Cho connects to something you'd rather not have me know. A longer pause this time. Park looked at him through the phone screen with an expression that was recalibrating. The visible shift of a man who came in expecting one kind of conversation and is now in a different kind. You're not protecting the succession, Park said slowly. No. You're building a case against your mother. Tae-jun said nothing. Park looked at him for a long moment. Then almost imperceptibly, something shifted in his expression. The slight adjustment of a man who has just found the edge of a situation more interesting than the one he prepared for. 6 weeks, Park said, and the Cho Communications. 6 weeks? And the Cho Communications, and nobody touches that car. Park looked at the car, looked back at Tai-jun. Agreed, he said. The two men in front of the car stepped back. Not far. Enough. The SUV behind them stayed where it was, but didn't move forward. Tai-jun looked at the phone screen one more time. One more thing, he said. My brother. Park was quiet. I'm not forgetting that, Tai-jun said. I want you to know I'm not forgetting it. Park held his gaze through the phone screen. I would expect nothing less. The call ended. The man pocketed the phone. The two vehicles began to pull back. Slowly. No urgency. They had gotten what they came for, or something close enough to it that retreat was orderly. Tai-jun stood on the street and watched them go. Then he turned and walked back to the car. He opened the rear door. Nia looked at him. Her face was very controlled, which meant she was running at a level of internal strain that her exterior was no longer fully containing. Malik sat beside her with his hands in his lap and his eyes on Tai-jun, and his expression doing the same thing it had done in the kitchen that morning. Reading, assessing, filing. We need to go, Tai-jun said. Not back to the safe house. Somewhere they don't have coordinates for. Somewhere only you know. Nia looked at him for a moment. Then, I know a place. Then take us there. She leaned forward and gave the driver an address. Tai-jun got in and pulled the door closed. As the car moved through the Baltimore streets, Malik said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, You made a deal out there. Tai-jun looked at him. I saw you, the boy said. Through the window. You were talking to someone on a phone. He looked at Tai-jun steadily. Was it a good deal? Tai-jun looked at his son's face, the jaw, the eyes. The 10-year-old who had spent the entire morning doing exactly what Tai-jun had spent 30 years training himself to do. Reading a room, staying calm, waiting for accurate information before making a judgment. It was the best deal available, Tai-jun said. Malik nodded slowly, filed it. Okay, he said. The car moved through the gray March city, and behind them the street where Park Dae-won's vehicles had been was empty now, and ahead of them was the address Nia had given. And between the empty street and the unknown address was the specific suspended moment that exists at the top of a wave before it breaks, when everything is still possible and nothing is yet decided, and the people in the car were still the people they had been. Before the morning began, even though none of them would be those same people, the address Nia gave was a place called Grandma Celeste's. It wasn't a grandmother, and it wasn't a restaurant. It was a community clinic in a neighborhood called Reservoir Hill, a converted row house with a hand-painted sign above the door that had been there since the 1970s, run now by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor, who was 61 years old and had trained alongside Nia during residency, and was the kind of person who, when Nia called her from the car and said only, I need the back room and no questions for a few hours, said doors unlocked and hung up. They arrived at 10:40 in the morning. The back room was a small office that smelled of old paper and antiseptic. 2 chairs, a desk, a couch that had been used as a bed often enough that the cushions had permanent impressions in them. Malik sat on the couch and opened his backpack and took out a book, which was the most clarifying thing Tai-jun had seen all morning. The boy's mother was shaking slightly now that the immediate emergency had passed, and her body was finally running the invoice of the last 2 hours. The shaking was invisible to most observers. Tai-jun noticed it because he was watching for it, and because he knew what controlled adrenaline looked like on its way out. He handed her a bottle of water from the desk without saying anything about it. She took it without acknowledging the gesture, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He sat in one of the chairs. She sat in the other. Malik read. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Malik said, without looking up from his book, Is someone going to tell me what's happening, or are we doing the thing where adults talk around it until they think I'm asleep? Nia looked at Tai-jun. Tai-jun looked at his son. We're going to talk about it, he said. Just give us a few minutes to get organized. Malik turned a page. Okay, but I already know some of it. What do you know? Nia said. I know you're scared. You don't get scared.
He said it matter-of-factly, the way children deliver observations that adults have been carefully hiding. Not cruelly, just accurately. And I know he's important somehow, not just someone from before. He finally looked up. He moves like people move in movies when they're in charge of things. Taejun said, "I'll explain everything, I promise."
The boy looked at him for a long moment, the same look he had given him twice already today, the one that had no deference in it, no performance of childhood for an adult's comfort, just a clean and direct assessment. Then he went back to his book. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." Taejun stepped into the hallway and called Baek Jin-ho. "The Cho Communications," he said. "Did Park's people send them? 40 minutes ago. Encrypted file. I've been going through them." Baek's voice was quiet in a new way. Not the professional quiet of a man delivering difficult operational information, but something underneath that, the particular stillness of a person who has read something that changed the geometry of what they thought they understood. "Taejun, there are communications here that predate Min-jun's death." He stood in the narrow hallway of the community clinic and let that land. "How far before?" he said. "The earliest one is 11 months ago." A pause. "Your mother initiated contact with Cho's office 11 months ago, 7 months before Min-jun was killed. The thing that moved through him was cold and specific, and took approximately 4 seconds to arrive at its full shape. He had been building toward this understanding since the car in Seoul, since the boardroom in Mapogu, since the moment Baek had told him the timeline of the firm's engagement was irregular. But building towards something and arriving at it are different experiences, and arriving at it now in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic, with his son 10 feet away reading a book, was its own particular weight. She was building a contingency, he said. The communications suggest she had an arrangement with Cho that predates the succession crisis. Cho's firm was identified as a resource for exactly this situation, a scenario in which succession became contested and a blood heir needed to be rapidly formalized. Baek paused again. The arrangement was not with Jade Fang directly, but Cho is connected to Jade Fang, which means your mother was working with a firm connected to Jade Fang for 11 months before your brother was killed. Did she know about the Jade Fang connection when she engaged him 11 months ago? I cannot determine that from the communications alone. But the arrangement is specific enough, and the due diligence thin enough, that I find it difficult to believe it was accidental. Baek's voice dropped slightly. Taejun, I've worked for your family for 22 years. What I'm about to say, I say understanding what it means. A pause. I don't think your mother caused your brother's death. I don't believe she wanted that. But I think she had a succession plan in place before the crisis, and I think that plan required a crisis to activate. And I think she was not careful enough about who she built that plan with. Taejun stood very still. Compile everything, he said. Complete record. Send it to the secure archive I designated. Nobody else sees it. Understood. And Jin-ho. He paused. Thank you. For documenting what you documented when you documented it. That matters. Yes, Baek said quietly. I thought it might. He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the wall. Then he went back into the room. He sat across from Nia and he told her everything. Not the operational version, not the managed version, with the edges softened for a civilian. Everything. From the boardroom in Mapogu and the photograph in the manila folder to his mother's communication with Cho 11 months before Min-jun's death, to the deal he had made on the street with Park Dae-won, to what Baek Jin-ho had just told him. He laid it out piece by piece with the same directness she had always demanded from him, and he had spent 10 years not providing. She listened. Malik listened too, from the couch. He had put the book down partway through and was listening with his chin in his hand and his eyes moving between Taejun and his mother, with the focused attention of a child who has decided that the adult conversation is more important than the pretense of not hearing it. When Taejun finished, the room was quiet. Nia looked at the window, then at the floor, then at him. Your mother may have had a plan in place that required your brother to be removed, she said, flat, testing the shape of it. I don't know that. I know she built a contingency, I know it involved a firm connected to the people who killed him. I don't know if she understood that connection or if she looked away from it because the contingency was more important to her than the question of who she was building it with. Those are very different things. Yes, he said, they are, and I may never know which one is true. He looked at her. That's the part I have to live with. She absorbed that. He watched her do it. The way she processed information that had no clean resolution, the way a diagnostician handles a case where the data is insufficient for a definitive answer. Not with peace, not with comfort, but with the specific acceptance of a person who understands that some questions are not going to close. What happens now, she said. To the syndicate. I go back to Seoul. I have 6 weeks of surface stability from the agreement with Park, which is enough time to formalize the internal structure without my mother's interference. I remove her from the succession process. Not from the organization, but from any decision-making role regarding this specific situation. He paused. And I spend the next 6 weeks building the case that Baek Jin-ho is compiling, because whatever my mother did or didn't know, what she did is something the council needs to understand. And after 6 weeks, the succession is either stable or it isn't. If it's stable, Park holds to the agreement. If it isn't, he stopped. That's a problem I handle when it arrives. And us, she said. The word was very precise, not romantic, just the accurate pronoun for the situation that now existed between her son, and the man across the table. That's not my decision, he said. That was never my decision. I took it from you 10 years ago, and I'm not doing it again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Malik. Do you want to say something? She said to her son. Because you've been listening for 20 minutes, and I know you have something. Malik straightened, looked at Tae-jun. The look had changed slightly from the earlier versions. There was something in it now that was working through a more complicated calculation. And watching a 10-year-old work through that calculation in real time was one of the more humbling experiences Tae-jun had had in a morning that had not been short on humbling experiences. Are you our father? Malik said. The word landed the way a word lands when it has been withheld for exactly long enough to arrive with its full weight. Tae-jun held his son's gaze. Yes, he said. Malik nodded slowly. He looked at his mother. She looked back at him, not directing, not softening, just present, giving him the room to be in the fact of it. Okay, Malik said finally. He looked back at Tae-jun. You left. Yes. Why? Because I was afraid. And because I chose being afraid over being a father, and there's no version of that I can explain that makes it better than what it was. Malik looked at him for several seconds. The clock on the desk ticked. Outside, somewhere in the clinic, Dr. Okafor's voice spoke to someone in a low professional murmur. Are you still afraid? Malik said. Tae-jun looked at his son's face. At the jaw that was his jaw, and the eyes that were their own thing. Something that had come into the world and grown for 10 years without him, and was sitting across from him now, asking a question with the directness of a person who has been raised to expect honest answers. Yes, he said, differently than before, but yes. Malik considered that. Then he said, At least you said so. They stayed at the clinic until early afternoon. Dr. Okafor brought food at some point. Sandwiches, juice for Malik, coffee for the adults, and asked no questions, which was the most useful thing anyone did all morning. Lee Sung-ho confirmed by text that the external situation had stabilized. Park's vehicles were gone, the Waverly House was clear, the DC team had arrived and established coverage. The immediate crisis had passed the way immediate crises do. Not resolved exactly, but receded, moved from the acute phase into something that could be managed with more time and less adrenaline. Tae-jun used that time to do 3 things. He called Baek Jin-ho and confirmed that the record was secured. He called Park and exchanged encrypted keys for the Cho communication file. And he wrote a message to his mother, not a call, a message because he needed it documented, that said, when I return, we will meet with the full council present. Not before. Do not contact Nia Monroe or anyone connected to her. Do not take any action regarding succession documentation. This is not a request. He sent it and put his phone away and didn't look at it again for 2 hours. What he did instead was sit in the back room of Grandma Celeste's community clinic in Reservoir Hill, Baltimore, and talk to his son. Not about the syndicate, not about succession or bloodlines or the architecture of what came next. Malik asked him about soul, what it looked like, how big it was, whether people really ate as much spicy food as he'd read. He asked about the flight, how long it took, whether you could see anything from the window at night. He asked, with the elaborate casualness of a child pretending a question is less important than it is, whether Taejun spoke Korean at home all the time or switched to English sometimes. Taejun answered everything, directly, completely, without the managed distance he wore in every other conversation he'd had for the last 15 years. Nia sat nearby and said little, but he was aware of her listening, aware of the quality of attention she gave to watching him with their son, the way she watched the way he spoke to Malik, the way Malik responded. She was running an assessment. He understood that. It was her right and it was appropriate, and he had no interest in performing anything for it. He just talked to his son. At one point, Malik said, "Do you know chess?" "Yes. Mom taught me from a book, but she won't play me anymore because she says I take too long to move," Nia said from across the room without looking up. "You take 45 minutes per move, Malik." "I'm thinking." "You're thinking for 45 minutes. That's what thinking takes." Taejun said, "I'll play you." Malik looked at him. "Now? Do you have a board?" The boy unzipped his backpack and produced a magnetic travel chess set with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been carrying the relevant tool for exactly this situation without knowing it. He set it up on the desk with quick, practiced movements. They played for an hour. Malik took 20 minutes on his third move. Taejun waited without moving, without checking his phone, without any of the impatience that the situation technically warranted. He watched his son think. He watched the way the boy's eyes moved across the board, not randomly, not with the scattered attention of a child, but in the specific pattern of someone who is genuinely modeling multiple futures simultaneously. He lost. Not badly. Malik had made 2 structural errors that a more experienced player would have avoided, but he lost. And when it was over, Malik looked at the board with the satisfied assessment of a person checking his work and said, "You went defensive too early. You were protecting something that didn't need protecting yet." Taejun looked at the board. "You're right," he said. At 3 in the afternoon, he told her he needed to go. Not back to Seoul yet. There were things to secure in the city first. Communications with Lee and Baek. The logistical infrastructure of extracting himself from a situation cleanly. But from the clinic. From this room. From the suspended hour that had existed outside of everything else. Nia walked him to the front door. Malik had fallen asleep on the couch in the back room, the travel chess set still open on the desk, which Taejun found himself looking back at from the doorway in a way that required a deliberate decision to stop looking. They stood at the clinic's front entrance. The March afternoon was gray and the street was quiet and ordinary. The kind of ordinary that feels significant when you've spent the morning inside something that was anything but. "I'm not going to disappear," he said. "I know," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just as a statement of current understanding. "Whatever happens with the syndicate, whatever the next 6 weeks look like, I want you to know that." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to trust that. I'm just telling you it's true." She looked at him for a moment. The direct look, the one that had always seen through the architecture he constructed around himself. It had not softened in 10 years. Nothing about Nia Monroe had softened exactly. She had deepened, solidified, become more precisely herself in the way that hard years either break people or concentrate them, and she was clearly the second kind. "He asked me once," she said, "about a year ago. He asked me if you were a good person." Taejun waited. "I told him I didn't know, that I knew you were complicated, and that complicated isn't the same as good or bad, it's just harder to sort." She paused. He said that sounded like a diplomatic answer. Taejun looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said he was right, and that some questions take a long time to get accurate answers to." She looked at the street. "I still don't have an accurate answer." "I know. But today—" She stopped, reconsidered the sentence, started again. "Today you came back and told me the truth when you didn't have to, when it would have been easier not to, when telling me created more problems for you than it solved. She looked at him. I'm noting that. He nodded. It doesn't undo 10 years, she said. I know. It doesn't mean I trust you. I know that too. But it's, she pressed her lips together briefly. It's something, okay? It's something. That's all I've got right now. He looked at her. At the woman who had rebuilt herself from the rubble of a decision he had made in under 30 seconds. Who had raised a son who played chess for 45 minutes a movie and carried a travel board in his backpack and asked adults whether they were still afraid. Who had walked out of a house in Baltimore with a bag over her shoulder and her hand on her son's back and never once looked like she was running. Because she wasn't running. She was moving forward, which is different. Which has always been the fundamental difference between the two of them. It's enough, he said. For now, it's enough. She nodded once, opened the door. He walked out into the gray Baltimore afternoon. He left for Seoul 3 days later. In those 3 days, he secured the communications Baek had compiled. He met with Lee Sung-ho and established a protocol for maintaining coverage of Nia's neighborhood. Not surveillance, not the syndicate's institutional eye, but a quiet human presence, 2 people who lived in the area now and would know if anything changed. He paid for it out of his personal holdings, not the syndicate's operational funds, which was a distinction that mattered to him even though nobody else would have tracked it. He also called Nia twice. The first call was practical. Logistics, contacts, a number she could reach in an emergency that bypassed the syndicate's main channels and went directly to Lee Sung-ho. She accepted it without comment, wrote down the number, asked 2 clarifying questions, and ended the call. The second call was less practical. He called on the evening before his flight, and she picked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And then she said, "He wants to know if you play online chess." He looked at the ceiling of his hotel room. "Tell him yes," he said. "He'll want to play constantly." "I know." A pause. "His screen time is limited to an hour a day. I'll work within the hour." Another pause. Longer. He could hear the sound of the house behind her voice, the particular ambient sound of a home in the evening, something on low in another room, a drawer opening and closing. "Taejun," she said. "Yeah." "What you said to Malik when he asked why you left." She paused. That was the right answer. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was just the true one. "Those are the same thing," she said. "That's what you never understood." He sat with that. "I'm starting to," he said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Safe flight." She hung up. He arrived in Seoul to a compound that had been waiting for him with the particular tension of an organization that has been running on uncertainty and is ready for it to be resolved one way or another. His mother met him in the front hall. She was dressed impeccably, which was how she faced difficult things, fully assembled, not a surface concession to the weight of what was about to happen. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the look between them contained more history than either of them could have articulated, and neither of them tried. "The council is assembled," she said. "I know," he said. "I asked for them." She looked at him. Something in her face, not vulnerability, not guilt. Those were not expressions Kang Soo-yeon kept in regular rotation, but something that was their equivalent. The look of a woman who has done a complicated thing and is standing at the point where she must account for it. "How much do they know?" she said. "They know what I've told Baek to share, which is everything." She absorbed that. "Everything," she repeated. "The firm, the timeline, the communications, the connection to Cho's network, all of it." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that what comes out of this meeting is not about punishing you. The council needs accurate information to make decisions, and they have been operating without it. That ends today." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. "And what about succession?" "Succession is being handled," he said, "through channels that don't go through compromised firms or agreements with our enemies." He paused. "Malik Monroe exists. He is 10 years old, and he is extraordinary. What happens with that? What role he chooses to have in this family, in this organization, in any of it, is a decision he will make when he is old enough to make it, with full information, with no pressure, with his mother as part of the conversation at every step." He held her gaze. "That is the only version of this that I will accept. If the council disagrees,
we will have a different problem. His mother looked at him. For the first time in his memory, in all 34 years of being her son, in all the boardrooms and strategy sessions and violent negotiations and losses, Kang Soo-yeon looked something close to old. Not weak, not broken, but the particular age of a person confronting the full cost of a calculation they made when the cost seemed manageable. "I didn't mean for any of this to harm him," she said. "I know," Taejun said. He believed it. He also understood that not meaning to harm and not causing harm were different categories, and that understanding the difference was the entire weight of what the next part of her life would require her to carry. "That's something you'll have to work with." He walked past her toward the council room. 6 weeks later, on an April morning when Baltimore had finally decided to be warm, Nia Monroe sat on her front step with a cup of coffee and watched Malik ride his blue bicycle in circles on the sidewalk. He had been doing it for 20 minutes, not going anywhere, just riding, the kind of circular motion that children use to think through things they haven't put into words yet. She recognized the pattern. She had been watching it for 10 years. He braked to a stop in front of the step. "Mom." "Is he coming back?" She looked at her son. His face was open in the morning light. The jaw that was not hers, the eyes that were entirely his own, the expression of a child who has been sitting with a question for 6 weeks and has decided this is the morning to put it out loud. "He said he would," she said. "Do you believe him?" She held the coffee mug with both hands, looked at the street. The tree at the edge of the sidewalk had come out in small green leaves overnight, the kind of green that appears in April almost as a surprise, even when you've been expecting it. "I think," she said carefully, "that he's trying to become someone who does what he says, and I think that's different from already being that person. But it's not nothing." Malik considered that, turned the bicycle handlebars back and forth slightly, the small, restless motion of a thinking child. "He beat me last Tuesday," he said. "At chess." "I know, you told me." He played aggressive. He stopped protecting things he didn't need to protect. He paused. "He's getting better." She looked at her son and felt the particular quality of a feeling that had no single name, the layered thing that is grief and pride, and something that might eventually become peace, if given enough time and enough honesty, if the people involved kept choosing the harder true thing over the easier false one. "Yeah," she said. "I think he is." Malik nodded, pushed off on his bike and resumed his circles, and she watched him go. And the morning was warm and ordinary and entirely real, and after a while she stopped watching him and looked at the street and let herself feel the full weight of the 10 years and the 10 days and everything in between, not as a wound and not as a victory, but as a thing that had happened, that she had survived, that had produced a boy on a blue bicycle who took 45 minutes to make a chess move and carried a travel board in his backpack and asked his father if he was still afraid. It had produced that. Whatever else it had cost, it had produced that. She drank her coffee, and the street was quiet, and the morning light came down through the April leaves the way morning light does. Without comment, without meaning, just the light, just the day, just the ordinary fact of being here and continuing. Inside her pocket, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from an unknown number that resolved, when she opened it, to a Seoul area code. 6 words. The council meeting went well. Baek says hi. She looked at the message for a moment. Malik rode past the step, leaned into a turn, came back around. She typed back 2 words. Good. Play tonight? The response came in under a minute. 7 his time, 9 mine. Tell him I've been working on something. She smiled. Not wide, not performed. Just the small real thing that happens when you're not expecting to smile and do. She put the phone away and finished her coffee and watched her son ride his bicycle in the April light, and did not think about what came next, and did not think about what had been, but only about the present tense fact of the morning and the boy and the green coming back into the trees after the long Baltimore winter. It was enough. For right now, in this light, with this coffee, watching this boy, it was more than enough. It was everything.